Hello, everyone. This is Kevin Mann again. Last week, or well, actually 2 weeks ago, I made a video basically introduce myself. We need to talk about propaganda and how to influence others. One reason that I talk about this is because I don't think people understand exactly how propaganda works, and hopefully I can elaborate for you and help clarify for you how it actually functions. But last time we talked about Professor David Graeber and his research into the origins of money. I also introduced to you the first paragraph of Edward Bernays' book, Propaganda, from 1928. And of course, in that first paragraph, he actually tells you they're manipulating culture. Well, I mentioned the 6 triggers. We went over a few, like reciprocity, consistency, social norms, or social proofs, which I call norms. But basically, it's the same thing. In other words, mores, what is moral, which comes from within. Norms, which is normal, that comes from, well, what we observe in the environment around us. So when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So I get that feedback from my fellow citizens, and I can ascertain what is normal, what's tolerable, what's proper. All right. I would like to allow Dr. David Graeber to elaborate on his link, because remember, he found a link between violence and money. I'll let him elaborate.
Now, here's the interesting thing. Coins are invented nearly simultaneously. It happens first in Lydia in the Eastern Mediterranean, but shortly thereafter, at least in broad historical terms, it happens in the Ganges Plain in northern India and in the plains of northern China, Ganges Valley, I'm sorry. The social situation seems to be the same, which is that money, in the physical sense, currency, is actually invented to pay soldiers. And it makes perfect sense if you think about it, because gold and silver are what money is denominated with, and you can use it for exchange, but it just isn't usually done. But soldiers are exactly the sort of people who are most likely to be doing this. First of all, from the perspective of a soldier, gold and silver has a huge advantage over a credit arrangement, because you can't actually steal a credit arrangement. You can't run off of it. On the other hand, gold and silver, it's kind of your equivalent of the suitcase full of $100 bills. Nobody knows where it's from, nobody asks, anybody will take it. So for soldiers, that's very nice. You can also melt it down, whatever, divide it up into small portions. So soldiers are likely to be carrying around loot. And second of all, if you have elaborate credit arrangements as the major way of transacting, well, a heavily armed guy who's just passing through is probably the person you'd least like to extend credit to if you can possibly avoid it. If he's carrying around little bits of gold and silver, well, good. So cash markets, insofar as they seem to first emerge, will tend to emerge right around wherever armies are parked, or where they have recently looted things and are, trying to get rid of the little bits of gold and silver and acquire the wine, women, and song and various other things that they like. Governments very quickly get in on the deal, and in fact, one interesting thing is, by the Adam Smith account, if money just sort of emerges from the need to get over the inconveniences of barter, well, it would be very hard to understand why governments demanded taxes in money. I mean, it might seem self-evident, but the moment you think about it, it isn't, because if gold and silver are just money, well, why not just grab the gold and silver mines? And in fact, governments would do that. I mean, ancient kings would normally grab the gold and silver mines. In theory, you have all the gold and silver you want, you got all the money. Why would you then take the stuff, stamp your picture on it, give it to people, and say, okay, everybody in the kingdom has to give me one of these back again? Think about it, it's kind of odd. But it makes perfect sense if you're trying to feed an army. Here you have this army of 100,000 people. They're sitting town on the border. Well, how are you going to get food to them? Under ancient conditions, unless they're next to the ocean, where it's easy, relatively easy to move stuff around, it's extremely difficult to move around large amounts of grain. They're going to eat everything within walking distance in a matter of weeks. So what are you going to do? Either you have to employ, another 100,000 people just bringing them stuff, or you can give them all tiny little pieces of metal with your picture on it and say, okay, everybody in the kingdom has to give me one back. Voila, you've just employed your entire population, getting soldiers things they want.
Also, I'd like to talk about or address cognitive dissonance. However, allow me to expound upon propaganda. When a corporation tells you the truth about their product, it's marketing. When a corporation tells you the lies about their product, it's propaganda. So even corporations, it doesn't have to come from government. Propaganda can actually come from any source. So if anybody's basically lying to you, technically, that is propaganda. If they're telling you the truth about the situation, well, that could be said to be marketing. So you're selling yourself, so to speak. I would also like to talk to you about the human fallacy. The human fallacy that I'm going to be alluding to actually is, I guess we could say, twofold, or maybe two separate fallacies. Maybe one is the fallacy of interpretation, and another is a fallacy of logic. But the first fallacy I want to address or just bring to your attention is sometimes we humans mistake identifying what we believe to be true for what we know to be true. Do you really know it? Can you say for sure, for a fact, that you know this to be true? Or do you just believe it to be true? If you have scrutinized it, if you have verified it, qualified it, then of course you can say you know it because you have done the due diligence to basically verify it. That's similar to like faith and trust. Basically, what we believe to be true, we can say, I have faith in it, right? I might say, maybe people might identify me as a humanist because I might say that I have faith in humanity, that we humans will find a replacement for fossil fuels once we run out, once we deplete those fossil fuels that we have as our power source today. So technically, I can say I have faith in humanity. Have we proven it in the past? Have we shown that humanity can come up with a replacement in such a situation? I would say probably not. We did do a transition from, say, maybe coal to oil over a century ago, but still, we still had something to fall back on. We had a safety net because we could always go back to coal. We didn't run out of coal. The other thing is in the Christian Bible anyway, we have, I think it even defines in the scriptures, it actually says faith is a belief in something unseen or unproven. So I think is how it's worded. But I may be paraphrasing. So in other words, faith is something that hasn't been through the scrutiny, hasn't been through the questioning. You basically just, accept it unquestioningly. You basically just accept it. It's kind of like the God of the gaps kind of theory, right? Because God of the gaps is this idea that, our ancestors, they saw an earthquake or they saw a volcano and they basically said, oh, why do we have this happen? And they said, well, anything they couldn't explain, basically they attributed to God. So it's kind of the same thing, is if you can attribute it to what you can say knowingly, well, maybe it's your God. But it's basically something taken on faith. It's basically unquestioned, without scrutiny. However, trust, on the other hand, I might say this chair can hold my weight. Well, why? Because I've tested millions, if not hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of chairs just like it. From these components, the structure, the composition, the engineering behind it, the ergonomics or whatever, all these things go into, well, it has earned my trust. We say we earn people's trust, right? So if you betray someone's trust in the past, then of course over time they can earn that trust back, but you're going to have to work hard for it if you betray someone's trust, right? So trust is earned. It has falsifiability, we might say. It is testable. It has been tested. Faith has not. Just like the difference between knowing and believing. Then, of course, this gets us to the two words pseudoscience and science. If you have studied any kind of pseudosciences in the past, well, like religion, theocracy of any kind technically is a belief system, an ideology, dogma. These, of course, are pseudosciences. They usually do not undergo the scrutiny that a science does. Science is based on rigorous analysis. In other words, we test and retest and test again. Why? Because we want to be more certain. Because, as you know, any good physics course is going to have that the professor is going to basically make you aware of the fact that, well, you're relying on your five senses to detect the world or universe around you. So, one, you are reading your tools and diagnostics through your five senses. Two, the tools that we even built to measure these things, we built utilizing these five senses, so you have to even trust the tools that you're using. So, again, you're basically using this perception, how we perceive, how we detect the world around us, is basically science. And we're having to rely upon this, our ability to detect the world around us, our senses. So when we talk about the, like Marcus Aurelius, who basically says there is no truth, there's only, basically perception. Excuse me. Well, that perception, of course, is, accepted because we do it, and that's why we want to measure it again and again and again. And that's why we also have margins of error. Oh, that's within a plus or minus, 3%, right? And of course, that's why when we talk about things in academics, usually we're talking about, well, it could be this, it's possibly that, it might be that. We usually don't speak in certainty. And that's because we all acknowledge that if you've ever seen it, that, your physics teacher might actually, have somebody come before the class and they'll basically measure their height. And then when they have them lie down and they're like, well, didn't we just measure you a second ago and now your height's different, right? So in other words, what you measure it and what I measure it could actually be different based on context. So and that's science. If you cannot duplicate my results in your lab, say in Paris, with what I found in, say, London, then I have problems. That's why science usually evolves. Science changes over time. Pseudoscience does not. It usually stays the same over thousands of years, and basically because it's dogmatic. They cherry pick their data. They basically, like phrenology, finding the lumps on somebody's head can basically determine the traits and characteristics of the person, kind of like astrology or numerology. But, it was quickly proven to be pseudoscience or not verifiable or even probably plausible. But they cherry pick their data. And so that's why probably for another century, at least another 60 years, even though phrenology was shown to be a pseudoscience, it still was found in the United States for like another 60, 80 years, or 60 to 100 years later, because people made money from it. People profited from it. So if you could basically charge someone to read tea leaves or to read palms or to read the stars or maybe read the lumps on their head like phrenology, you basically would do it. And of course, because it was a way to make money. And that's the reason it actually lived, even though it is technically, like I said, a pseudoscience. And of course, that's why we can also say that, like Karl Popper was the probably the greatest, or one of the best known philosophers of science of the 20th century. And he says, a theory that explains everything explains nothing. And that's because it has no falsifiability. So just keep in mind that if I measure, say, the infection rate of, say, COVID-19 and I test 100% of the population, I don't have to extrapolate out. I have the results of 100% of the people. However, if I only test like 5% of the people, and I have to mathematically extrapolate out and say, well, the other 95%, oh, they would match this, you're not going to have as accurate a reading. Same thing. In other words, the higher the number, the higher the inclusion of the main populace. Pseudoscience is basically dependent on the anecdotal. Pseudoscience depends on the anecdotal evidence, and science depends on the empirical evidence. Pseudoscience, and honestly, we do this every day. We humans, we base our judgment on anecdotal evidence all the time. Oh, it's hot outside today, so global warming must be real. Or, like I said, when in Rome. So when in Rome, do it this way because you happen to see 2 out of 3 people do it this way. 2 out of 3 is not a very big, model to build. You only based it on 3 people, or 3 out of 4, or maybe 4 out of 5. Still, that's better, but still, you're talking about that's anecdotal. Okay, so while I'm here in Sichuan or Chengdu, China, then maybe, the people, 3 out of 4 of my friends make hupi qingjiao this way, so I'll do it this way. Maybe they don't have access to the ingredients that other way that they use some of these other ingredients and elsewhere around the country. So when in Rome, so you have conditioned yourself to basically say, okay, this is the norm. This is what's acceptable, and this is how we make hupi qingjiao here in Chengdu. But it's basically based on anecdotal evidence, right? We humans also have a fallacy when it comes to pattern recognition. In other words, if you see a debate, have you ever tried to go to a debate where they had like 10 people on the stage and they had like 10 different arguments going on at the same time? OMG. Oh my God. That's hard. You better have a notebook and pen with you, because there's a reason that we humans put debates into a false dichotomy. Most anything can be argued, 10, 20 different faceted, or 10 different ways. In other words, they purposely force it into a pro and a con, a for and against, A to B. I can compare A and B all day long, but you ask me to compare A to B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S. Oh my God, I would, you know what I'm saying? It would be almost impossible. However, this is where artificial intelligence has the advantage. Artificial intelligence is actually a misnomer, but I'll talk about that in a second. But artificial intelligence is great, or computers are great at recognizing patterns. The problem is with humans is we see that one thing we might just recognize it, but sometimes we don't even see it. We don't even see the differences. Or even if we see the differences, we don't acknowledge them because we say, oh, that's just nuanced. That's an exception. That's semantics. And so we choose to ignore it because we're like, oh, that can't be anything serious, because, that's such a trivial difference. While AI, artificial intelligence, sees the difference and will document it because there is no feelings. In other words, we humans we trust our feelings too much. We basically use emotion to basically weigh, is this feasible? Is this credible? Is this verifiable? Is this feasible? So, but I would just remind you that artificial intelligence is a misnomer. Why? Because intelligence is based on, knowledge. If you look at, say, wisdom versus knowledge, acquiring knowledge like AI can do, it acquires knowledge at a rate that is very impressive. However, it's aware. It knows. It has been exposed to the data. So it recognizes the data. However, what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Knowledge and wisdom is basically, well, knowledge is the data, the know-how, the exposure, the awareness of the data. Wisdom is the application of that data, the application of that knowledge. So when people talk about, oh, well, artificial intelligence is, going to be a threat. Well, for one thing, it doesn't possess wisdom. That comes from us. Two, I wrote an article about it a couple of years ago, was, we say, well, another fallacy would be that, we say that we're destroying our environment. Oh my God, we're all destroying the planet. So the sky is falling, right? Chicken Little. So if we have that fallacy to destroy our own ecosystem, did we implant that same fallacy? Did we put that same fallacy or expose or insert that same fallacy into AI? Because think about it. What animal on Earth actually utilizes the digital environment, the virtual world, computers? Humanity is the only species on planet Earth that actually utilizes that ecosystem. I call it an ecosystem because if AI is as smart as you say it is, then by killing humans, if you basically say, oh, to save Earth, we have to get rid of all the humans, then you're basically saying, oh, we're going to basically destroy humans who maintain and build our ecosystem. In other words, AI does not exist outside digital and virtual worlds. So you're basically saying it suffers from the same fallacy that we suffer from, that it's basically going to destroy its own ecosystem to try to save what, if we destroy humanity, are we going to somehow save Earth? The Earth will, as George Carlin said, Earth will shake us off like a bad case of fleas, and it'll probably be here billions of years longer than that we'll ever exist. So, sure, if we do kill ourselves in the process, Earth will probably say good riddance. But so the whole argument about AI being a threat is erroneous. However, let me get to, because I don't want to spend a lot of time on that anyway. I just made those 2 quick points. However, let me tell you, or offer you an anecdote. Let me offer you an anecdote. When I was in high school, I had a teacher named Bill Alexander. He was one of the football coaches, so everybody called him Coach Alexander. But Coach Alexander, he also taught biology. He was a geneticist for a while and actually worked in a genes lab. And so he knew all about, genes and inheritance or hereditary traits and all this kind of thing, and, dominant and recessive genes and that kind of thing. So he incorporated that into his biology class. But he also taught us something, the 5 ways we learn. And I think this was actually one of the more important things he taught us was, well, how we learn basically influences what we know or what we believe to be true. So let me continue. The first of these processes is called emulation imitation, basically monkey see, monkey do. So we learn facial expressions while we're lying in the crib. So those people who said, oh, wear a mask 24/7, there are studies coming out today that basically are saying that if you wore a mask 24/7, 24 hours a day, you probably did your baby a big disservice, because you may have hindered their ability to learn facial expressions from you. Also, when my wife and I had our first child, we basically, she was an infant, and then she didn't even have a single tooth in her head. We're eating dinner, and we look down while we're eating dinner, and Leia, all she has in her mouth is breast milk. And so we look down, and what is she doing? She's chewing. She's chewing. Why is the baby chewing? She doesn't even have a single tooth in her head, and like I said, all she has in her mouth is milk. So she was monkey see, monkey do. She was imitating mommy and I. So it's like one of the first skills we utilize as a human being is monkey see, monkey do. We also learn how to sing, or maybe how to cook, or maybe I even learned how to set the dinner table from watching television. That's the true story. Anyway, but that's the first technique. That's emulation imitation. The second technique that we use is memorization. Memorization is how we learn language, right? So we didn't invent the symbolism. We didn't invent the symbols, but we have to memorize that symbol maybe represents like 3 different sounds. So for the letter A, or we have to know what the numbers or delta and lambda and beta, what all these mean. So, and the plus sign and equal sign and all these other symbols we have to memorize. But that's why linguists tell us today that in order for you to master a word, regardless of language, you have to hear a word 70, that's 70 times. So that's why it takes a lot of repetition. That's why memorization is rote education. In other words, do it again, like drilling, drill and ceremony in the military. So you do it again and again and again. Recite that poem, recite that text. But of course, that's why you also have to memorize your equations or your algorithms for chemistry and physics and trigonometry and calculus and all these other maths and different types of sciences. Is like an algebraic theorem that we constantly memorize in like Algebra 101 basically is if A equals B and B equals C, therefore A must equal C, right? And that's considered a theorem in algebra is considered like law, right? It's basically unquestioned. It's not, we basically, like I said, we trust it as, or treat it as a law. So we basically say, okay, I commit it to memory. So it's the same thing with, all your other, pi r square, d equals m over v. We have to memorize all these equations. Otherwise, that's why we basically use repetition again and again and again. And like I said, language and math, anything that involves symbolism is going to have to be learned through memorization. The third technique that we use is called trial and error. According to science, they say that 80 to 85% of everything that we learn comes through trial and error, right? So if you see the blue screen of death, the GPF, the general protection fault, basically, and you hear a tone, those messages from the computer are telling you what's wrong. So let me try that to fix it. That didn't work. Let me try something else. No, that didn't work. So the third thing I try, maybe it worked. So the next time I hear that error tone or see that error message, I'll try that first and I'll repair it faster maybe. But, Mama says, don't touch that. That's hot. What's the first thing we do? We reach out and touch it. Why? Maybe I didn't know what hot meant. So sometimes I just have to prove it to myself, right? So, even the best intentions from our parents, our friends, our relatives, they're basically trying to warn us about certain actions that maybe could harm us or maybe hurt us emotionally. Or, so it's just something, don't get involved with puppy love while you're in school, sweetie. Focus on your studies. But some of us just have to teach ourselves the hard way and have to experience it for ourselves. We end up with that broken heart. But anything involving motor skills, like sports, like ping pong, tennis, baseball, eye-hand coordination, like computer games, playing a musical instrument like a piano or drums or anything, all of them take, or just dribbling the basketball or jumping rope, these things all take motor skills and eye-hand coordination, and basically we hone our skills. So anything that we can say practice makes perfect, that is basically trial and error at work. So that's why we can say that 80 to 85% of everything we learn comes through trial and error. The last two techniques that we use to learn are basically used in tandem. And of course, the fourth one is comparing. When we compare two things, like I said, we're really good at comparing two things. You try to compare 10 things at the same time, you're going to have a headache, basically, because it's not easy to do. But at least comparing A to B, that's why we usually, as humans, we basically will isolate them and then compare. Isolate, compare, isolate, compare. And so, so that's why we compare A to B, then B to C, and then A to C, because I can't compare all three of them at the same time. It's like I said, it's just a fallacy of humans, the way we logically think, our thinking patterns maybe. But when we compare, say, a square to a rectangle, a square and a rectangle, both four-sided, both parallelograms, both have four right angles, and the opposite sides are of equal length, right? So technically, I can say a square is a rectangle, right? In other words, the square meets all the parameters for what a rectangle is. However, can I say a rectangle is a square? Of course not. And that's why we use the other skill, contrasting in tandem, because contrasting, we find the differences. Comparing, we find the similarities. So compare the two things, how are they alike? Contrasting, how are they different? So of course anyone can look at this at a glance and basically say, okay, one is 4 equal sides, the other is 2 pairs of equal sides, or equal length. So, I don't mean to insult anyone, but I told you we'd come back to this algebraic theorem. In A equals B and B equals C, therefore A must equal C, what are we doing? We're actually comparing A to B, we're comparing B to C, and we're comparing A to C. In fact, you're doing it right now, right? So, for example, how did you come to the decision or come to determine that the sky is blue? Maybe A could be, is what I saw for myself. I think the sky is blue. Maybe B is what Mama, or you heard Mama say, the sky is blue. So A to B, they're equal. Both of you say it's blue. And of course, if Kevin today, if I am telling you, today I'm telling you the sky is blue, okay, so A equals B, B equals C, therefore A must equal C. So they're all in unison. They're all synonymous almost. So, but what if today I tell you the sky is green? Okay, so if I tell you the sky is green, since we just met, you're probably like, when your warning bells are going off, dee, 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 dee. Kick Kevin out as a reliable source, right? So he's saying the sky is green, or he's just colorblind. But what if, though? What if you and I have a working relationship? What if you and I have built a rapport over time, and maybe I've given you good advice over time that is actually reliable, and you have known me for such a long time that you maybe even rely on some of that sage advice that you might even say, because it's been good advice. And I tell you today, the sky is green. You will do mental gymnastics to make sure I'm right. You will basically say, well, Mama says the sky is blue. I see the sky is blue, but Kevin says the sky is green. Could it be aquamarine? Could it be greenish blue or bluish green? Maybe Kevin is just colorblind. Maybe you'll excuse it away. In other words, you'll do anything to justify that you both your trusted sources, because if you have two trusted sources that have contrast or contradict one another, it causes us a little bit of stress, because you can't help but stress about, well, if Kevin's wrong now, could he have been wrong 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Uh-oh. what if? And then what's even worse, what if you find out it's malicious? It wasn't a mistake. I lied. I lied to you. I actually told you, a falsehood, a lie, and you know it was a lie. It wasn't a mistake. Then you're like, well, wait a minute. Why is he lying? Why is he betraying my trust? Then it really causes stress, because you're like, if he lied then, could he have lied those other times? Because it's basically, that I don't want to reevaluate all these years in my entire belief system. This is cognitive dissonance.
These experts in psychology highlight their valuable experience for us as to why this evidence can still be so difficult for people to accept.
When we hear information that contradicts our worldview, social psychologists call the resulting insecurity cognitive dissonance. For example, with 9/11, we have one cognition, which is what the official story of 9/11, what our government told us, what our media repeated to us over and over, that 19 Muslims attacked us. On the other hand, we have what scientists, researchers, architects, engineers are now beginning to tell us, which is that there is evidence that shows that the official story cannot be true. So now we've lost our sense of security. We are starting to feel vulnerable. Now we're confused.
9/11 truth challenges the beliefs that our country protects us and keeps us safe, and that America is the good guy. When your beliefs are challenged, fear and anxiety are created. In response to that, our psychological defenses kick in, and they protect us from these emotions. Denial, which is probably the most primitive psychological defense, is the one most likely to kick in when our beliefs are challenged.
What some of us will tend to do is deny the evidence that's coming our way and stick to the original story, the official story, and to try to regain our equilibrium in that way. Another thing we can do is decide to look at the conflicting evidence and be sincere and be open-minded and look at both sides of the issue, and then make up our own mind about what reality is. Here are a few of those spontaneous initial reactions to hearing the contradictory evidence about 9/11.
I don't want to know the truth, or I'd become too negative and psychologically go downhill. I'm not sure I want to know. If this is true, then up would be down and down would be up. My life would never be the same.
They say, this is the way the world works, and I'm convinced this is the right way the world works. 9/11 doesn't fit into that paradigm. So I don't need to look at the evidence.
I refuse to believe that many Americans could be that satanically treasonous. Someone would have talked. But these are beliefs. They are not scientific facts. But these beliefs do keep us from looking at the empirical evidence. Whenever we say, I refuse to believe, we can be sure that the evidence that's coming our way is not bearable, and that it's conflicting with our worldview much too much. As I thought about all of these responses, I realized that what is common to every one of them is the emotion of fear. People are afraid of being ostracized, they're afraid of being alienated, they're afraid of being shunned, they're afraid of their lives being inconvenienced, they'd have to change their lives, they're afraid of being confused, they're afraid of psychological deterioration, they're afraid of feeling helpless and vulnerable. And they're afraid that they won't be able to handle the feelings that are coming up. None of us want to feel helpless and vulnerable.
If you have two trusted sources that contradict one another, you will have cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance basically says, no, you know how the world works. Just keep marching. Just, procrastinate. Maybe it's just a mistake. Maybe you misheard. maybe you miscommunicated, or he miscommunicated to me what he really meant. Or maybe I just don't understand what he's really saying, because cognitive dissonance is too much stress to deal with, that, oh no, I'm going to have to reevaluate my entire belief system. So we use this comparison as a weight. In other words, you are comparing what you already know to be true with what you're hearing today. It has been established in your mind that maybe on that weight scale, this is 20 grams. What's on the other scale? You accept it. However, that's why they want to catch you when you're young, because they want to establish their theory as your standard. Because once they establish their theory as your standard, they know that standard will be what you weigh and evaluate everything else you encounter in life. So that's why they want to catch you early. They want to catch you young so they can establish their theories as your standards. So that's why they want to catch you young. It's all about establishing your standards for you. Let's talk about the echo chamber. The echo chamber is what I call it, but the creation of the echo chamber is basically, remember we talked about the 6 triggers with Edward Bernays, reciprocity, consistency, norms. But the echo chamber is how we deal with norms.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
We are concerned about the trouble and trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false news
has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 So are these actors reciting lines from a script? Are these newscasters reporting the news? We create our own echo chambers when we surround ourselves with like-minded people. If I'm a Republican, I surround myself with other Republicans. If I'm a communist, I surround myself with other communists. If I'm a Democrat, I surround myself with other Democrats. We like that attaboy, Kevin. You understand everything perfectly. Great job. We like that, that affirmation or confirmation from our friends and our associates that we basically are on top of it. But where do you ever hear dissenting voices if you basically build in sociology a echo chamber for yourself? You don't have access to those dissenting voices, do you? Well, the echo chamber is an environment where a person only encounters information or opinions that reflect or reinforce their own opinion. So what's the purpose of the echo chamber? Who would actually want to make one? The CIA. There's only one problem. The echo chamber predates the CIA. Remember, the CIA was created in the same legislation that created the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the National Security Council. They were all created by the National Security Act of 1947. The echo chamber comes earlier by decades. The first person I ever heard talk about where this came from was Ted Gunderson. Ted Gunderson, of course, in an interview back in the 1980s, he said,
I worked a number of high-profile cases since I retired, the Jeffrey McDonald case and the McMartin case, and worked with F. Lee Bailey on some cases also. Mm-hmm. And I've given these reporters information, and then nothing came of it.
Nothing happens.
And I'd see them later, I'd say, what happened? Oh, my editor wouldn't let me print that.
Right.
So they're controlled by, and if you go back, I have this, by the way, also in that book that you have right there, the Illuminati book.
Illuminati, yeah, right.
I have a copy of the newspaper article, February 9, 1917, of the Congressional Record, which I know you have it too. Right. That the J.P. Morgan interests bought up 25 of America's leading newspapers and inserted their own editors in order to control the press. This occurred in 1915. This, by the way, is on 2947 and 2948 of the Congressional Record.
Right, and you've got that in here too.
I've got that in there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we popped that right up on the TV screen. And
right.
Everybody was like, I mean, their chins were hitting their chest. And
there you go. That was 85 years ago.
Right.
So are you going to tell me that William Guy Carr doesn't know what he's talking about when he says control the press? Are you going to tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about, or you don't know what you're talking about? Well, you had the same document.
So let me introduce you to three gentlemen. Representative Joseph H. Moore, Representative Oscar Callaway, and Representative M. Alfred Michelson. They started, or Oscar Callaway stood before the floor of the House and basically said, Mr. Speaker, may I read some articles into the Congressional Record? And he said, yes, you may. So he stood on the floor of the House of Representatives, and he proceeded to read articles starting February 9th, 1917, some articles into the Congressional Record. In case you don't understand, the Congressional Record will never be expunged, never be erased, never be modified, never be destroyed. It is for all posterity, for everyone to see. Your great-great-great-grandchildren will be able to have access to what they did even, centuries from now, right? So, let me see if I can read this to you. All right, he read, in March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interest, the steel shipbuilding and powder interest, that's gunpowder. In other words, we're talking about the defense industry of 1915. And their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States, and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. So what does that mean? In other words, these people from the defense industry of 1915 got together and said, how many newspapers must we buy in order to influence or to control the narrative in the United States? Must we buy them all? And of course, these 12 men high up in the newspaper world basically came back and said, no. They decided 25 papers were agreed upon, and they commenced to purchase the policies of these papers. In other words, the 25 most influential newspapers in the United States in 1915 were purchased for their editorial rights, for their policies, that they call them. In other words, the New York Times, Boston Globe, LA Times, and Chicago Tribune, and 21 others. But this was the start of building the echo chamber. The echo chamber, of course, is, you have to remember, in 1915, the only way to influence people was through word of mouth or printed media. In other words, you had to write it on paper, media, newspapers, journals, magazines, things like this. So back in 1914, 1915, you had basically a program where Britain said, join England's war. They sent 53 of their most popular and most famous authors, including H.G. Wells, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Gilbert Murray, Sir Horatio Gilbert, George Parker, G.K. Chesterton, and like I said, 53 of them went around the globe. They went to Canada, they went to America, they went to Australia, they went to South Africa, they went to New Zealand, and they basically said, join England's war. I'm German American. It's a fact. In 1915, there were more German Americans than there were Welsh, English, Scottish, and Irish combined. In other words, there are more German Americans in 1915, and even today, that's true. There are more German Americans than there are British Americans. So how did they convince Americans to join the war on England's side? I mean, like I said, most of us had family back in Germany. So, I mean, how did they... No, it was propaganda, of course, as you know. But H.G. Wells did voice or express regret for participating in this propaganda program, by the way. However, you'll notice that radio did not become commercially available until 1920, and of course the television was not made commercially available until 1941. The creation of the echo chamber predates the CIA, right? So they basically monopolized them all. They monopolized silver screen, they monopolized the newspapers, they monopolized radio, they monopolized television. They monopolized them all. So as long as you can monopolize the airwaves, as we might say, you can fake social proofs. You can fake norms. So what you conceive as normal, that's unpatriotic. How dare you not support the war? If you can't support our troops in Iraq, then just leave. You should move to Canada, or you should go back to Germany, or go back to Uganda, or wherever you came from. That's un-American. So if you hear people saying stuff like this, and you are hearing it everywhere, basically, support the war, that's American. That's un-American not to support the war. You start to question your own morality. Wait, I think war is immoral, but wait, everybody else seems to be supporting the war, so if everybody else is supporting war, maybe I should too. So you basically have people doubting themselves. And so that's part of what a PSYOP is. It instills doubt. It makes you question your own ability or own judgment, because you're like, well, wait a minute. Everybody else seems to be supporting the war. Maybe I should too. But when you talk about Project Mockingbird came out in 1963. That was the CIA. The echo chamber predates the CIA by decades. So Project Mockingbird is not the creation of the echo chamber. Mockingbird is the basically transfer of the administration of the echo chamber to the American CIA, because they created it back in like 1921 or 1917 actually. But Mockingbird is just where they transferred their administration of that echo chamber to the Americans. But this is why the internet is the game changer. In other words, the internet, phones, smartphones, everybody is now a journalist today. So I could say I was there. I was there on January 6th. I could tell you what happened at the Capitol building. I saw it. Here, I'll share it with you. You could see it for yourself. And because everybody today is a journalist, because everybody today is able to show, in other words, there's more of us than there are of them. They can no longer hide the truth. The internet and smartphones have cracked their echo chamber. Their echo chamber is they can no longer manipulate the narrative. They can no longer keep the truth from us, because the internet and the like I said, the smartphone basically disallow them from monopolizing the narrative. They underestimated the internet. And of course, we might get into Project Looking Glass next time. I know I said I'd get into racism, but the thing is I don't have time today. You guys, long live the Republic, and God bless.